My journey into this forbidden history did not commence with a search for the fantastical. I was not hunting for monsters in the dark corners of folklore, nor was I seeking to validate the whisperings of ancient myths that most rational minds have long since discarded. My initial focus was entirely academic, grounded in the tangible, cold, hard reality of stone, granite, and mortar. I was researching architectural anomalies, the structural oddities that plague the accepted historical narrative of the 18th and 19th centuries. I was documenting the physical inconsistencies of our built environment. Doorways that stood far too tall for the eras in which they were constructed. Staircases that were too grand and steep for human comfort. And furniture scaled beyond any reasonable human proportion. These are what we call standard historical curiosities. The trivialities that mainstream historians typically file away under the convenient labels of decorative excess or ceremonial design before hurrying on to safer, more explainable topics. We are told, repeatedly and without nuance, that our ancestors built on a massive scale simply to impress the peasantry, to intimidate the commoner, or to mimic the divine stature of the gods. For a long time, I accepted that explanation. It was safe. It was logical. It fit the timeline. Until I found the photographs. These images were not paintings born of an artist's fevered imagination. They were not sketches, not interpretative tapestries, and certainly not folklore passed down through generations of oral embellishment where a man grows an inch with every retelling around a campfire. These were photographs. Actual, physical, undeniable photographic evidence dating from the mid to late 1800s. They depicted human beings of impossible scale standing casually, almost mundanely, next to what we would consider regular-sized people. The proportions were so dramatic, the height difference so jarring to the moderns' eye, that my first instinct, like that of any rational skeptic, was to assume they were composites. I assumed they were the result of trick photography, forced perspective, or early darkroom manipulation. But they were not composites. I analyzed the film grain, and it was consistent across the entire plate. I studied the lighting, and it matched perfectly across the subjects. The shadows fell correctly, draping over the giant figures and the normal bystanders with the exact same solar angle and density. These images predated the technology required to fake such scenes convincingly. There were no digital tools, no airbrushing techniques capable of such seamless integration in the 1860s. That is the precise moment when the official explanations began to collapse under their own weight. The deeper I went into the archives, digging through forgotten collections and dusty albums, the more of these photographs I uncovered. It was not a handful of isolated anomalies that could be dismissed as genetic flukes. It was a catalog of a forgotten demographic. I found carte de visite from the 1860s, cabinet cards from the 1870s, and tintype images showing men, and occasionally women, standing 8, 9, sometimes 10 feet tall. These were not circus performers advertised as the world's tallest man for a penny show. They were not showmen with documented stage names and traveling routes. They were just people, individuals photographed in formal settings, wearing period-appropriate clothing, standing with a quiet dignity that belied their extraordinary nature. Sometimes they were surrounded by family members of normal height, creating a tableau that defies our current biological understanding of the human genome. The British Museum archives contain several of these images, buried deep in their unassigned collections. The Smithsonian mentions them in passing, only to dismiss them instantly as medical anomalies, cases of gigantism, without further investigation into their lives or longevity. French collections show similar images, catalogued, filed, and subsequently forgotten. Russian imperial records reference persons of unusual stature, serving in ceremonial roles, yet treating them as a distinct class of citizen. The pattern is always the same, regardless of the country or the archive. Acknowledge the existence, categorize it as a freak occurrence, and move on immediately. Never investigate. Never ask why. But the questions persist, nagging at the edges of the narrative. Why were there so many of them? Why do the photographs cluster in specific decades, appearing primarily between 1850 and 1900, and then suddenly disappear from the record entirely? Why do contemporary accounts from that era describe these individuals not as monsters, invalids, or bedridden patients suffering from rapid growth disorders, but as normal, functioning members of society? They are described holding positions of authority, working as guards, overseers, and foremen of major construction projects. And here is the strangest part, the detail that bridges the gap between biology and architecture. Many of these photographs show the giants standing in front of buildings. Massive buildings. Buildings with doorways that seem absurdly oversized for normal humans, but are perfectly, ergonomically proportioned for the individuals pictured in the frame. We have been told these buildings were designed for grandeur. We are told the high ceilings and 12-foot doors were meant to make the common man feel small in the face of the state or the church. But these buildings suddenly make functional sense when you place a 9-foot-tall human being in the frame. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The architecture stops looking like artistic excess and starts looking like ergonomic necessity. I began measuring doorways in government buildings dating back to the 1700s and 1800s. I found doors 12 to 15 feet high, not just at the main entrance, where grandeur might be the primary goal, but inside, in the working corridors, in the back offices, where aesthetic intimidation serves no purpose whatsoever. I found staircases with risers so tall that a normal person must stretch to climb them comfortably, causing a disjointed gait, yet a giant would ascend them with natural ease. I found furniture, desks, chairs, beds, in estate sales, and museum backrooms, all slightly too large, all dismissed as custom-made for eccentric tall individuals. But it is not just one building, and it is not just one eccentric owner with a penchant for large furniture. It is thousands of structures. Courthouses across America, administrative buildings throughout Europe, government complexes in Russia, India, and South America. They were all built in the same period, all featuring the same oversized proportions, and all supposedly designed this way for aesthetic reasons, despite the obvious impracticality for the average human. We are asked to believe that for 2 centuries, humanity collectively decided to build structures that were difficult to heat, difficult to clean, and difficult to navigate solely for the sake of style. This makes no functional sense, unless the people using them were not average-sized, unless the architects were designing for a client base that history has decided to erase. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across the globe. In St. Petersburg, administrative buildings from the 1700s have 12-foot doors in the back hallways, areas never meant for the public eye. In Buenos Aires, municipal structures feature staircases requiring enormous strides that defy the average inseam. In Delhi, Colonial-era government buildings, supposedly built by and for British administrators of average stature, contain furniture at scales that would make a 6-foot man feel like a child. These were not ceremonial spaces. These were working buildings, offices, administrative centers, the everyday architecture of governance and oversight. Who were they built for? This is where the subject of Tartaria becomes impossible to ignore. If you are not familiar with the term, Tartaria appears on maps from the 1700s and early 1800s as a vast territory spanning northern Asia. It was not a legend, and it was not a myth. It was an actual, labeled region, appearing in encyclopedias, atlases, and historical records with the same casual certainty that we assign to France or Spain today. Then, sometime in the mid-1800s, it vanishes. It is not conquered and renamed. It is erased. The maps are redrawn. The encyclopedias are edited to omit it. The history books pretend it never existed. Yet, the architecture remains. We find massive stone structures across Central Asia, Russia, and Mongolia. Buildings of impossible scale and precision. Doorways sized for giants. Halls that echo with vastness. These are all supposedly built by various empires or local craftsmen, yet there is no documentation, no verified construction records, and no explanation for how they achieved such engineering feats with the primitive technology supposedly available to them. What if the giants were not anomalies? What if they were the administrators? What if they were the overseers, the guardian class of a civilization we have been taught to forget? What if Tartaria, whatever political entity it actually was, employed these individuals not as curiosities, but as functional members of society? And the architecture reflects that reality. This theory would explain the photographs. It would explain why the giants are always shown in formal, official contexts, often in positions of authority. It would explain why they disappear from the photographic record after the 1890s, right when the last references to Tartaria vanish from official records. It explains why the buildings remain, but the occupants have been written out of history. This raises a simple but critical question. If you wanted to erase a civilization from collective memory, wouldn't you start by erasing the most visible evidence? The individuals whose very existence proves that something else was here. The photographic record is not the only evidence we have. Throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, newspapers across America regularly reported discoveries of giant human skeletons. These were not scattered anomalies. They were systematic findings. The New York Times, 1885, 7-foot skeleton discovered in Michigan Mound. The San Diego Union, 1895, bones of extraordinary size found during railroad excavation. The Middletown Signal, 1899, giant human remains uncovered in Ohio. These were not tabloid sensations from the fringe press. These were mainstream newspapers reporting what was, at the time, considered newsworthy, but not particularly controversial. The accounts describe skeletons measuring 7 to 12 feet in length, often found in organized burial sites, and frequently accompanied by artifacts suggesting advanced metallurgy and construction knowledge. Then something changed. After approximately 1920, these reports stop. They do not fade away gradually. They stop abruptly. Discoveries that were once front-page news simply cease to appear. As for the skeletons already found, many were sent to the Smithsonian Institution for further study. The Smithsonian now claims no such skeletons exist in their collections. They are listed as missing, lost, or misplaced during routine transfers. Hundreds of specimens, all vanished without proper documentation. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Discoveries peak in the late 1800s, the same period the giant photographs appear, and the same period Tartaria disappears from maps. Then everything stops. The photographs stop. The newspaper reports stop. The maps change. The encyclopedias rewrite themselves. It is as if someone decided that certain questions were no longer acceptable to ask. Why would you bury evidence of human biological diversity? Why would you systematically remove physical proof that challenges the standard narrative of human history, unless that proof suggested something larger, unless it implied a different structure to recent civilization than the one we have been taught? Let me propose something that sounds absurd until you examine the evidence. What if the giants were not rulers, but a specialized class? Guardians, overseers, administrators of infrastructure and construction. What if their size was functional, not ceremonial? What if the buildings were scaled to them because they were the ones overseeing their construction and maintenance? It would explain the architectural patterns perfectly. It explains why government buildings, courthouses, and administrative centers, structures of oversight and control, feature oversized proportions, while residential areas remain human-scaled. It explains why the photographs show giants in formal, official contexts rather than domestic settings. Me explains why historical records mention them in roles of supervision and authority, but rarely as merchants, artists, or common laborers. It would also explain the construction mystery. How were massive stone structures built with such precision in the 1700s and 1800s, often in timelines that seem impossible for human crews? Maybe they were not built by the civilizations we credit them to. Maybe they were built for those civilizations by a previous society that employed individuals physically capable of moving stones, operating machinery, and overseeing construction at scales we consider impossible. And it would explain the systematic erasure. If you are inheriting structures you did not build, inheriting technology you do not fully understand, and inheriting architectural systems designed for a different type of human being, what do? You adapt the narrative. You claim the buildings as your own. You rewrite the construction dates. You backdate the architects. And you remove any evidence that suggests someone else was here first. Ask yourself, how many mysterious construction techniques suddenly make sense if you assume the builders were physically larger and stronger than modern humans? How many impossible engineering feats become merely difficult if the laborers stood 9 feet tall? The evidence suggests something much larger than random genetic anomalies. What disturbs me most is not the evidence itself. It is the coordinated silence surrounding it. Academic institutions do not debate the giant skeletons. They pretend they never existed. Museums do not display the photographs. They file them in archives marked miscellaneous or unverified. Historical societies do not investigate the architectural proportions. They dismiss them as artistic choice. The pattern repeats across disciplines, across countries, across centuries of scholarship. It is not active suppression in the sense of men in black burning books. It is passive erasure. It is a culture of questions that simply are not asked, evidence that is not examined, and dots that are not connected because connecting them leads to conclusions that do not fit the established narrative. When you point it out, when you lay the evidence side by side, the photographs, the architecture, the newspaper reports, the missing records, you are met with the same response. Interesting, but not significant. As if coincidence explains everything. As if patterns do not matter. As if asking why is somehow inappropriate. But the why is the entire point. Why did humans of extraordinary size exist in sufficient numbers to be regularly photographed and regularly discovered in burial sites? Why were they documented, then forgotten? Why does architecture from a specific period accommodate their proportions? Why do these elements cluster in the same geographical regions and time periods as Tartaria's disappearance from the cartographic record? And why, when you mention any of this in academic circles, does the conversation immediately shut down? I keep returning to the photographs. These were not monsters. They were not myths. They were people. Individuals with faces, clothing, and families. People who stood for formal portraits like anyone else in the 1800s. People whose existence was so unremarkable at the time that photographers saw no need to explain or contextualize their presence. But we have made them remarkable by erasing them. We have made them impossible by denying they were ever possible. We have turned documented reality into forbidden speculation. And in doing so, we have lost something profound. Not just knowledge of who they were, but an understanding of what we are. What have we forgotten? What have we inherited without comprehension? The massive doorways remain. The oversized staircases still stand. The buildings that make no sense for human proportions continue to serve modern functions, their original purpose obscured by centuries of adaptive reuse. We walk through them daily without asking why. We accept the official explanations without examining whether they actually explain anything. Because examining them requires accepting that history is not a straight line of progress. It requires accepting that we might be living in the remnants of something more sophisticated, something we didn't build, something we don't fully understand. It requires accepting that the giants in the photographs were not aberrations, but evidence of a different arrangement, a different society, a different world. I stumbled across enormously sized chairs in estate auctions and forgotten museum storage rooms. These are chairs that make no anatomical sense. They are not thrones. They are not ceremonial pieces meant to intimidate or impress subjects. They are ordinary chairs, dining chairs, desk chairs, sitting chairs, designed for daily use, except they are scaled wrong. The seat height measures 30 to 36 inches from the floor, nearly double the standard 18-inch height that accommodates normal human leg length. The backrests tower 7, sometimes 8 feet high. The armrests sit at a height that would leave an average person's arms dangling uselessly at their sides. Yet, auction catalogs list them as decorative furniture or display pieces, as if people in the 1800s routinely commissioned chairs they could not physically use just for aesthetic purposes. Museum curators label them oversized Victorian design, without explaining why such designs appear in government buildings, administrative offices, and courthouse waiting rooms. Functional spaces where comfort and usability would presumably matter. And then there are the instruments themselves, the artifacts no one wants to classify. I am talking about the massive wrenches found in demolition sites across Europe and North America. These are tools measuring 4, 5, sometimes 6 feet in length. They are not decorative. They are not ceremonial. They are functional tools with wear patterns, with the kind of grip erosion that comes from actual, repeated use. They are tools designed for hands much larger than ours. Museums categorize them as industrial equipment or display novelties, without explaining what industrial process would require a wrench weighing 200 pounds that needs to be operated by someone with the grip strength of 3 normal men. Auction houses sell them as antique curiosities without asking why they were manufactured in such quantities that they keep appearing in estate sales, barn cleanouts, and building demolitions more than a century later. Suddenly, the oversized tools and the oversized furniture are not anomalies anymore. They are confirmation. They are the physical remnants of the hands that built the world we occupy. So who were these giant people? Were they the guardians of Tartaria? Were they the administrative class of a civilization we have been taught never existed? Were they the overseers of construction projects whose scale and precision we still cannot replicate with modern technology? Consider the Capitol buildings found in almost every American state. We are told these were constructed by settlers, people arriving in wagons, struggling to survive harsh winters, battling disease and hunger. Yet, we are expected to believe that simultaneously, while living in log cabins and mud huts, they were quarrying granite blocks, weighing tons, transporting them without railways, and assembling domes and rotundas with the mathematical precision of ancient Rome. And they did this in just a few years. The timelines do not match the technology. The workforce does not match the population data. But if you introduce a workforce of beings who stood 9 feet tall, who possessed the physical leverage to manipulate these stones, who had the stride to navigate the scaffolding, suddenly the impossible becomes plausible. The settlers didn't build these structures. They found them. They repaired them. They moved in. And eventually, they erased the memory of the true architects. I do not have definitive answers. I only have questions that accumulate. Questions that build upon each other, creating a weight the official narrative can no longer support. Why does the photographic evidence cluster in the exact decades when Tartaria disappears from maps? Why do architectural proportions match the scale of individuals in those photographs? Why do newspaper reports of giant skeleton discoveries stop precisely when references to advanced pre-industrial technology begin to be omitted from historical records? It is not coincidence. It is not random variation. It is not a series of independent anomalies that happen to align. It is a pattern. And when you see the pattern, when you trace it across continents and centuries, when you watch it appear and disappear with suspicious precision, you have to ask, what aren't we being told? What did we inherit that we have chosen to forget? What knowledge was lost or hidden when the maps were redrawn and the giants disappeared from history? The buildings remember, even if we do not. The photographs preserve what the encyclopedias erased. The evidence persists, waiting for someone willing to ask the questions everyone else has agreed not to ask. Who were the giants? Why did they disappear? And what else vanished with them that we are still pretending was never here at all? The silence of history is loud, but the stones are speaking. We just need to be tall enough to hear them.